I will then start discussing with you on Economic Survey Volume 2. That is what we will initiate ourselves on. We will talk about Economic Survey Volume 1, Chapter 2. That is where we will start talking right now. And it's quite connected to Chapter 1. So let's see. And last time when we talked about Chapter 1, I deliberately did not touch on the last page of that chapter. जब पिछली बार हमने चैप्टर 1 की बात की थी तो उसके लास्ट पेज की बात जहाँ पे स्ट्रक्चरल रिफॉर्म्स की बातचीत है वो मैंने जानबूझ के आप लोगों से नहीं की थी. On the last page of the chapter, we talk about structural reforms. So I deliberately did not talk to you on that because, that becomes relevant today. Now, the second chapter is mostly about, the second chapter, it talks about managing fiscal policy for balancing बिजनेस साइकिल. अब कुछ बातें समझना. ऑलराइट, किसी भी ग्रोथ को मैनेज करने के लिए, टू मैनेज एनी ग्रोथ इन आवर सिस्टम, किसी भी ग्रोथ को मैनेज करने के लिए two types of policies become relevant. To manage any growth, any systemic issue, two types of policies become relevant. One is cyclical policies. This is managing the business cycle. So this refers to your fiscal and monetary policy. This refers to your fiscal and monetary policy. So fiscal policy क्या हुआ? Government expenditure increase or decrease, taxation rate increase or decrease. So whatever you do via your government budget, is your fiscal policy. Or monetary policy क्या हुआ? Your interest rate management. That how do you manage your interest rate so that you can manage your business cycle. अब इसमें आप terms जब पढ़ते हो, counter cyclical. When you hear the term counter cyclical, तो counter cyclical का मतलब हुआ that if economy has a boom period, तो boom period का मतलब क्या हुआ? High growth, inflationary tendencies are high. Boom period, that is high growth, say high inflation, kind of a thing. Then if you are following a contractionary policy, in a high growth, high inflation phase, if you are following contractionary policy, that is reducing G, increasing tax, that is a contractionary policy. In such cases, you say it is counter-cyclical. So this is contractionary fiscal policy. And similarly, you can go for a money supply decrease, and this is a contractionary monetary policy. Or an interest rate increase, and this can be a contractionary monetary policy. On the other hand, if during a recession, during a boom you are doing this, if during a recession, if you have a recession, and during that recession, if you are following an expansionary policy, so expansionary fiscal policy will mean G increase, T decrease, and expansionary monetary would mean increasing money supply, reducing interest rate. This is called counter-cyclical policy. Alright, so जब भी आप कहते हो the policy is counter-cyclical, it means you are following an expansionary policy during a boom and during a recession, and a contractionary policy during a boom. Expansionary policy during a recession and contractionary policy during a boom. क्यों करोगे ऐसा? तो एक सर्वे उसे एक्सप्लेन करते हैं. सर्वे बोलते हैं that counter-cyclical fiscal policy will have positive impact on economy. First is, it reduces output fluctuation. It reduces output fluctuation. A pro-cyclical policy will increase output fluctuation. If there is a pro-cyclical policy, सोचो अगर उन्होंने ग्राफ भी आपको बना के दिया on their in the survey on page 46 of the survey, they give you a graph of how with time the output gap will rise and fall. You know, so reduces output fluctuation means that keeps output range restricted around full employment output, or what we call potential output. In my video on solution to mains questions of GS, I have already defined potential output for you. So hopefully you would have seen that full employment output or potential output. So in that case, during a recession, since the government is supporting the economy with more expenditure, the GDP doesn't fall much below the potential. And during a boom, since the government is restricting its own expenditures, the GDP doesn't rise much above its potential. So fluctuations controlled हैं. अगर गवर्नमेंट प्रो साइक्लिकल पॉलिसी करने लगे कि ड्यूरिंग अ बूम खूब सारा और खुद भी खर्च करने लगे और ड्यूरिंग अ रिसेशन खर्च कम कर दें, तो रिजल्ट क्या होगा उस केस में? देन ड्यूरिंग अ बूम output will rise by a greater amount, and during a recession it will fall by a greater amount, leading to fluctuating inflation and macroeconomic instability. That is the aspect. तो पहला benefit तो ये कर देते हैं कि वो आपके output fluctuation को control करते हैं. And second, inflationary expectations are better managed. Inflationary expectations are better managed. क्योंकि लोगों को पता है कि अगर रिसेशन है तो सरकार डिप्रेशन में इसे नहीं जाने देगी. It will not lead to deflation. Government will come in and start spending. So recession can be revived or can go to revival. Or similarly, if it is boom, government won't make it turn hyperinflationary. They will interfere and make sure that the boom is restricted. So that is why inflationary expectations are kept under check. So overall macroeconomic stability is maintained if you follow a counter-cyclical fiscal policy. If you follow a counter-cyclical fiscal policy. इस बात को चर्चा करने की ही जरूरत क्यों पड़ी? समझना इस बात को. इस बात को चर्चा करने की जरूरत इसलिए पड़ी क्योंकि जो लिटरेचर है, you know, the literature in modern world, economics literature, has developed a fashion that more expenditure of the government is not necessarily good for the economy. That is why they say that government expenditure, G as I called it, should always be curtailed. ये एक फैशन ट्रेंड है. फिस्कल डेफिसिट should always be kept stringently under control. To keep macroeconomy stable. Now, nothing wrong in this. इसमें कोई गलत बात नहीं है. लेकिन अगर आप सडनली एक रिसेशन फेस कर रहे हो, अगर आपको कोविड के जैसा कोई बीमारी के वजह से इकोनॉमी हालत खराब है, जहां आपके कंजम्पशन ऑलरेडी लो है, कंजम्पशन कंट्रीब्यूट्स 54% ऑफ इंडियाज जीडीपी एंड कंजम्पशन हैज बीन फॉलिंग. Investment contributes around 30% of GDP, and that has been in a negative zone, like in a less expectationary zone. तो फिर उस गैप को फिल करने के लिए government expenditure will have to rise. To fill that gap, then government expenditure will have to rise. That is what the economic survey is trying to implore. And then they are trying to set, in this chapter, and then they are trying to set the condition as to in what conditions this can happen comparatively more easily. All right, because the developed economic systems have reached a position where their interest rate is already very low. The developed economies see an interest rate close to 0%. their inflation is very stable, they have reached their production possibility curve, so they can do nothing from supply side. वो अपने यहाँ रिफॉर्म्स करके या रूल्स चेंज करके या न्यू टेक्नोलॉजी इंट्रोड्यूस करके खूब ग्रोथ लाने की हालत में अब नहीं है उतने. बट इंडिया काइंड ऑफ एन इकोनॉमी इज नॉट देयर. We are in a position where we can do structural reforms, now please understand that, and which can manage for the fiscal deficit that we run. That is what the survey says in this chapter. So apart from cyclical changes, you need structural reforms. And what are these structural reforms? These structural reforms is improving ease of doing business so that you can produce more and attract more people into business. So improving ease of doing business, improving infrastructure supply to reduce logistical cost, improving infrastructure supply, improving input market laws, like if your labor laws are very rigid or your land acquisition laws are very rigid, then improving input market laws, that's another thing that you can do. Another is improving human resource through better education, better health care, and all this is where government can always make a big contribution, spend more, and spend more productively. Improving intellectual property rights, environmental protection laws, these are all structural improvement. तो एक तरफ तुम अपने cyclical management करो, business cycle को manage करो with a counter-cyclical policy, और दूसरे तरफ structural management करो, make sure your laws improve, your administrative structure improves, efficiency goes up, which can push up growth in your economy. So in that sense, focus on growth and manage your debt is what the survey is trying to say in chapter 2. So they are advocating, that we should go for a counter-cyclical fiscal policy or counter-cyclical fiscal monetary combination in India. They say that when it comes to government's net balance and private sector net balance, एक वो समझना आप, जब आप कहते हो, I am talking from page 44 on economic survey. All right, page 44. Government net balance. तो ये है savings of financial, non-financial, and departmental public sector units, banks, public sector companies, oil companies, all of them units, and of general government. तो general government की saving होगी अगर fiscal surplus है तो general government minus capital formation, that is investment पे जो खर्च किया इन्होंने, capital formation of same entities. Same entities means they are the financial, non-financial and departmental public sector units and of general government. Alright, so all these same entities. तो जो save किया इन्होंने minus जो capital formation में खर्च किया वो इनका net balance है. जो save किया इन्होंने माइनस जो कैपिटल फॉर्मेशन में खर्च किया फिर जो बचा वो नेट बैलेंस है. नाउ दिस नेट बैलेंस कैन बी पॉजिटिव, दिस नेट बैलेंस कैन बी नेगेटिव डिपेंडिंग ऑन वेदर कैपिटल फॉर्मेशन इज हायर देन सेविंग और लेस देन इट. एंड सिमिलरली यू कैन हैव प्राइवेट नेट बैलेंस वेयर यू कैन हैव सेविंग्स ऑफ कॉर्पोरेट सेक्टर, प्राइवेट कॉर्पोरेट ऑफ कोर्स, प्लस हाउसहोल्ड minus gross domestic capital formation by same entities. Gross domestic capital formation कुछ भी नहीं, investment के लिए ही एक दूसरा नाम है. Another name for investment is gross domestic capital formation. And then the survey shows that these two things are highly correlated. Minus 0.9 is the correlation coefficient in developed countries. इसका मतलब क्या हुआ? That developed countries में as soon as government saving goes down, private saving goes up. If private saving goes down, government saving goes up. That is a counter-cyclical balance. that in developed countries, there is a counter-cyclical balance. That as one goes down, the other goes up. That is a counter-cyclical balance in developed countries. In developing country like India, the same correlation has been found to be, for India, this has been found to be minus 0.29. तो वो कहते हैं the correlation between government saving and private saving, or government net balance and private net balance, is pretty weak in India compared to what it is in developed countries, showing that developed countries have very often, yes it does, Yogita, government countries, structural reforms are different from quantitative easing, Mayank. Government, factors, showing that government balances, net balances are not very closely correlated inversely to private net balances in India. इसका क्या मतलब हुआ? अब ये बात लिखने का क्या मतलब हुआ? मतलब ये हुआ that in India we have the scope that if private sector reduces its savings, government can afford increasing its expenditure. Private sector reducing its saving means what? That private sector reducing its saving, or if this net balance of private sector is rising, that means private sector is saving more than investing. Net balance of private sector is rising, that means private sector is saving more than investing. Survey is saying, if you see that happening, it means private sector consumption and private sector investments are going down. अगर प्राइवेट सेक्टर सेव ज़्यादा कर रहा है और इन्वेस्ट कम कर रहा है, तो इसका मतलब वो कंजम्पशन भी कम कर रहे हैं क्योंकि सेविंग ज़्यादा कर रहे हैं और इन्वेस्टमेंट भी कम कर रहे हैं, तो उनके नेट बैलेंसेस बढ़ रहे हैं. इस केस में प्राइवेट सेक्टर की डिमांड कम होगी, ना वो कंज्यूम कर रहे हैं ना इन्वेस्ट कर रहे हैं. इफ प्राइवेट सेक्टर इज सेविंग मोर देन इन्वेस्टमेंट, दैट मीन्स दे आर कंज्यूमिंग लेस and they're investing less, so their aggregate demand contribution will become lesser. That is the time when government should come in and start investing more. So if private net balance is rising, then no harm if government net balance falls. That is counter-cyclical. All right, if private net balance is rising, then no harm that government net balance falls. That is counter-cyclical. Why counter-cyclical? Because as private net balance is rising, it means their savings are higher than their investment, and since they are saving, it means consumption is also not very high, which means now to balance aggregate demand, you need government to start saving less, investing more, spending more, and that can balance overall C plus I plus G. This is what they are trying to teach you with the discussion on page 44, that make it counter-cyclical in India also, the way it is in other countries. All right, so this gross domestic capital formation, this is C, not E, this is C. Gross domestic capital formation that you have is nothing but investment done by different entities. तो जैसे ही सरकार देखें कि प्राइवेट सेक्टर ने अपना इन्वेस्टमेंट कम कर दिया है और अपनी सेविंग्स बढ़ा दी हैं, तो सरकार को उल्टा कर देना चाहिए. That's again an example of counter-cyclical. So the discussion on 44th page tells you that, and then they give you reason. They say that, see, it will have some benefits that it will create. It will have some benefits that it will create. I have an advice there. The advice is that focus on the box that you have, focus on the box that you have on page 48. That is the box that is more important. On page 46 and 47, the boxes that are there are simply saying the same thing again and again, that how counter-cyclicity helps. But 48 page gives you economic theories based on which counter-cyclicity helps. So according to me, if you are planning an answer for this system, this chapter and basic, the question kya aa sakta hai? Justifying counter-cyclical fiscal policy. That will be the question, that how do you justify a counter-cyclical fiscal policy? Kya hai counter-cyclical fiscal policy? That if the economy is in a recession, then government should spend more. Or if households are found to be consuming less and corporates are found to be investing less, then government should start spending more. That's counter-cyclical. So in that case then, the best justification comes from the 4 points that they give you on page 48 box, because that is the best place to be there at. All right. Ayush, I hope you got your answer of what does it signify. So when you look at it, then please understand this now. We say that counter-cyclical fiscal policy is effective because, and these points that I am giving you is combining the points on pages 46, 47 and 48 from economic survey. Pages 46 to 48 economic survey. These points is what I have collected. All right, and I'm discussing those points with you. The purpose of discussion, I repeat, is not to give you just an overview of survey. The purpose is to get into detailed discussion of survey and try understanding what they are saying and in what purpose, relevance for our examination thing. Again, the purpose is not to give you an intellectual debate. The purpose right now is specifically focusing on how you should make your notes and how you should understand survey. Along with these videos that you will that I'm discussing with you, I have already started on my Telegram channel and your groups that I will be giving you MCQs related to survey, which will be attached to these videos also. So MCQs related to survey, and also I will be discussing with you certain long answer questions gradually as and when they come. So one of them I'm discussing with you right now, that the benefits of counter-cyclical fiscal policy. So one is that an increase in government expenditure increases aggregate demand by increasing G proportion of it. I hope you all understand that C plus I plus G plus NX, this is your aggregate demand. Consumption plus investment plus government expenditure plus net exports. C plus I plus G plus NX, this is your aggregate demand. So if you increase G, that's where it starts increasing. The government expenditure rises and that pushes demand upwards. So in a counter-cyclical policy, when economy is seeing demand falling, then government expenditure rise can push that demand upwards, creating the Keynesian demand system, as we call it. Then one is that, of course. Second is that it results in reviving of animal spirits. That is the second thing. Revives animal spirits through multiplier effect. What does that mean? Government increasing its expenditure will mean, अब सरकार ने मान लो सड़क बनानी शुरू की, तो कुछ लोगों को एम्प्लॉय करेंगे, सड़क बनाएंगे तो उसके ऊपर से खरीदेंगे, सीमेंट खरीदेंगे, चारकोल खरीदेंगे. So if the government starts employing people, buying the raw materials like cement, charcoal, coal and so on, bitumen, then they will start giving income in the hands of the people who are selling these commodities. That will mean these people will then go to the market, buy more things. They will get that income will then go into the third hand, and that third person will go to the market, buy more things, will go into the fourth hand. That's multiplier effect that gets created. So now investors will see demand, the private producers will see demand, and they will think this is the right time now, demand is picking up, let's start investing more. This is again animal spirits moving from bearish to bullish. कि लोग जो उम्मीद खो बैठे थे, जिन्हें लग रहा था अब डिमांड तो हो नहीं रहा, क्या फायदा इन्वेस्ट करके, उन्हें डिमांड दिखने लगा, and they will be interested in spending and investing more. They can see that demand, and now they can be interested in spending and investing more. So that's another aspect that the government can work upon. Reviving animal spirits. Again, typical Keynesian mantra as it comes to it. The third is provision of liquidity in the economy. Provision of liquidity in the economy leading to increased consumption. Provision of liquidity in the economy leading to increased consumption. Now, when you say provision of liquidity in the economy leading to increased consumption, that implies that you are talking about people getting jobs, and as people get jobs, people getting jobs, and as people get more jobs, people get more employment, people get more expenditure that is done by the government in their hands, they can revive their expenditure and start consuming more and more. They can revive their expenditure and then start consuming more and more. So the extra income generated by the government, this is due to reduction in tax. So your disposable income goes up. आपके पास पैसे थे, उसमें से सरकार टैक्स मांग रही थी. अगर सरकार एक्सपेंशनरी पॉलिसी अप्लाई करे और टैक्स कम मांगे तो आपके हाथ में डिस्पोजेबल इनकम, दैट इज जो पैसे खर्च करने के लिए हैं, वो बढ़ जाएंगे. Your income after tax will be higher. So if government starts asking for lesser tax, then your income after tax will be higher, your disposable income will be higher, and that will contribute to higher consumption. So liquidity in that sense. And it will lead to increased government expenditure leading to increased liquidity. More money in the hands of the people. Increased government expenditure leading to more liquidity. So more money in the hands of the people. And both these things together can then contribute heavily to people buying more of the commodities. Then, not necessarily, Shiv, not necessarily. Then, if you look at it, another is but that it will reduce banking spread. Increasing liquidity by reducing banking spread. Banking spread is difference between deposit rates जो बैंक देते हैं depositors को and lending rates जो बैंक लेते हैं अपने borrowers से. The difference between deposit rates and lending rates is your bank spread. So that again gets reduced. What is the benefit now? It means now that banks will be encouraged to lend more, because in that case, see, counter-cyclical government expenditure means more bond supply in the market. More bond supply in the market means bond prices fall and interest rate rises. So in that case now, even if the banks have to pay high deposit rates, they will still be able to manage high lending for themselves. Counter-cyclical का मतलब जैसे सरकार ने देखा कि लोग सेविंग बढ़ा रहे हैं, सरकार ने अपने खर्चे बढ़ाए. सरकार ने खर्चे बढ़ाए, थोड़ी सेविंग सरकार ने ली, इंटरेस्ट रेट बढ़ने लग गया. As government sees people are increasing their savings and consumption is being reduced, government starts mopping up some part of that saving from the market. Banks are allowed to reduce the spread, and lenders are then encouraged, to lend to the people, because now borrowers see, please understand this, borrowers will now see that if they deposit their money in the bank, say they are getting 6% return, if they are borrowing from the bank, they have to pay 7% return. That's a thin spread. बहुत कम difference between deposit rate and lending rate. Government expenditure can allow the bankers to do that, and that means you will find people borrowing more easily, encouraging them to consume and invest again. तो जब भी banking spread कम होता है, consumption investment के लिए borrowings बढ़ जाती हैं. तो recession में अगर सरकार ज़्यादा खर्च करेगी, तो उसका नतीजा ये होगा कि सरकार borrowing जो firms हैं उनकी lending demand कर रही है, जिसके वजह से डिपॉजिट रेट्स के हाई रहने पे भी लेंडिंग रेट्स थोड़े हाई रह सकते हैं. बैंक्स के पास लिक्विडिटी हो सकती है, रिजल्टिंग इन बोरोअर्स डिमांडिंग मोर फ्रॉम द बैंक, एक्सपेक्टिंग हायर इन्वेस्टमेंट, रिजल्टिंग इन more demand in the market because government chose to spend more in the market. This is the counter-cyclical impact if government decides to spend more and squeezes the spread between borrowing and lending. Government decides to spend more and squeezes the spread between borrowing and lending. Now, another thing that the survey says it does is that increased fiscal multiplier during recession. अब समझना इस बात को. Increased fiscal multiplier during recession. During recession. They say there are two reasons for this. Increased fiscal multiplier during recession. What is fiscal multiplier? समझना आप इस बात को. Fiscal multiplier is the constant which shows change in income of the economy due to change in government expenditure. Fiscal multiplier is that constant which shows change in income in the economy due to change in government expenditure. तो कितना इकोनॉमी में इनकम चेंज हुआ गवर्नमेंट के एक्सपेंडिचर चेंज करने के वजह से, उसे कहते हैं फिस्कल मल्टीप्लायर. By how much does income change due to government changing expenditure is what we call fiscal multiplier. Now see, the survey says that during a recession, fiscal multiplier tends to be higher. That during a recession, fiscal multiplier tends to be higher. They say one, increasing government expenditure stimulates labor demand and creates income for the people. So increasing government expenditure stimulates labor demand. Increased government expenditure stimulates labor demand, creating more income, stimulates labor demand. बढ़ा देता है labor demand को और income create करता है. And in an economy like India, समझना इस बात को, developed economies, what happens is that workers keep shifting from government job to private job and from private job to government job. There is no segmentation between these two. So in a developed economy, if government increases employment, then capacity of private sector to give employment becomes less, because then people shift to government job and private sector cannot provide, doesn't get workers. तो डेवलप्ड इकोनॉमी में लोग मूव करते हैं गवर्नमेंट जॉब से प्राइवेट जॉब में, प्राइवेट जॉब से गवर्नमेंट जॉब में. तो जब सरकार ज़्यादा एम्प्लॉयमेंट देती है तो लोग गवर्नमेंट जॉब में चले जाते हैं और प्राइवेट सेक्टर के पास वर्कर्स की कमी हो जाती है, जिसके वजह से सरकार के प्रोडक्शन बढ़ाने पर भी प्राइवेट सेक्टर का प्रोडक्शन कम रह जाता है और इसे लेबर टर्म्स में क्राउडिंग आउट कहते हैं. If in the developed economies, since the market of labor is not segmented, segmented means divided. It's not divided. People shift from government job to private job and vice versa very frequently. So if government gives more employment and increases output, private sector doesn't get workers and that has a negative impact on output. So government expansion doesn't have that much impact. But in a developing economy like India, where there is huge segmentation between government job and private job, even if government increases expansion and expenditure, it will not mean that private sector will lose workers. It will not mean that private sector will lose workers. And therefore, employment or related crowding out will not happen. ये नहीं होगा कि सरकार के खर्चे बढ़ाने के वजह से और एम्प्लॉयमेंट बढ़ाने के वजह से प्राइवेट सेक्टर को एम्प्लॉयमेंट नहीं जनरेट करने को मिल रहा. ये नहीं होगा इंडिया में. क्यों? क्योंकि हमारे यहाँ लोग आराम से सरकार से प्राइवेट और प्राइवेट से सरकार नहीं जाते. Segmented regime है. So in that case, even if government increases its expenditure and increases employment, people will still be doing work in private and others in government, and that will create more employment and more output thereafter. So that is why they say that fiscal multiplier during recession will tend to be higher in India, because already private sector is not in a position to employ much and government is providing employment. So some people start getting that employment and they do better. Another reason why fiscal multiplier is आप ऐसा सोचो, during a recession, labor supply is greater than labor demand. So a stimulus will mean that labor demand will rise, government will hire more workers, gives the economy a positive push. Also, when government spends more, in that case, during a recession, people face this liquidity constraint even more so. During a recession, people face this liquidity constraint even more so. तो वो liquidity constraint कम होगा, जिसके वजह से fiscal multiplier की value high हो जाएगी. Because people will get more liquidity in their hand, so liquidity constraint will be reduced and people will be able to spend more in the system. So that is why they say that during a recession, government does it much better. Also, another reason it happens is increased fiscal multiplier due to positive expectation about future. It gives bullish sentiments, positive expectations about future, because in a recession people need more support from the government because everybody is feeling down and negative. So with this positive support from the government, it implies a counter fiscal policy or counter cyclical fiscal policy is a much better idea. with respect to facing a recession in a developing country like India. So from pages 42 odd to 48, this is what survey tries discussing. ये पहले 6-7 पेज का एक synopsis हुआ कारण के साथ कि सर्वे क्या बात डिस्कस कर रहे हैं. Then they introduce, a talk which is, no Shiv, this question is not relevant, control that. If migration happens in case of a developed country, please understand this. If migration happens in case of a developed country, then in that case you are increasing your labor source. Now it will depend on how you are using your capital and how much potential GDP do you have. So in that case, that has nothing to do with your fiscal deficit. You may run a fiscal deficit, you may not, but a migration may not impact your counter-cyclical activities or pro-cyclical activities much. As long as you don't get very skilled people who can contribute heavily to your potential GDP, and if your potential GDP goes up, then maybe you are in a position where you can afford having higher fiscal deficit. So please be careful on that question. Okay, coming to this now, then the survey introduces, starting page 48 end part, onwards, and from page 48 end part onwards till approximately page 59 odd, in fact a little more than that, page 56 odd, they keep discussing this. Page 48 to 56, they keep discussing debt sustainability. Debt sustainability. They keep discussing the idea of debt sustainability. Please understand now, when you say debt sustainability, please be careful here. When you say debt sustainability, it means your debt in time period T to your GDP in time period T, if it is declining or constant, your debt is sustainable. अगर आपका ये debt क्या है? Total loans taken in economy by your government. So if your debt is GDP ratio is declining over a period of time, or at least remains constant, you have a sustainable debt. Now think, your debt at any time period T will be nothing but your debt in time period T minus 1. Your debt in any time period T will be nothing but your debt in time period T minus 1 plus interest rate that has to be paid on debt in time period T minus 1. अब ये इतना डेट तो तुम accumulate करके लाए हो पिछले साल से. ये debt is already there. You have accumulated it from past years. Plus the interest you have to pay on that debt, and plus your primary deficit. In a simplistic economics term, GT minus TT, economic survey calls it PBT. Primary balance का नाम दे देते हैं वो इसे. Economic survey calls it a PBT. They call it primary balance. So whether your debt is rising or falling, dt minus 1, whether your debt is rising or falling, dt minus 1, will be a function of how much interest you have to pay plus your primary deficit or primary balance PBT. आपका ये debt ये positive होगा अगर ये सारा कुछ high enough और positive है, और ये negative हो जाए अगर ये चीज़ अगर T greater than G हो जाए, and primary balance is greater than the interest payment. ये situation है that your total expenditure is your, say, interest that you have to pay on old debt, and your total expenditure apart from that is also the government expenditure that you do. But if your tax collection and your revenue generation is higher than that, if your income or revenue sources give you higher return than the expenditures you do, your overall debt will start falling. That means that if you take a debt to GDP change, if you take a debt to GDP change, using this equation, you can write something like dt is equal to 1 plus r dt minus 1 plus primary balance at time period t. dt is equal to 1 plus r dt minus 1 plus primary balance at time period t. And that then, if I dividing by GDP growth at time t, you get something like dt upon GDP t equals to 1 plus r upon 1 plus g dt minus 1 plus pbt. ये मैथमेटिकल डिराइवेशन किया जा सकता है, अभी के लिए मेरी बात मान लो, समझो कि ऐसा हो सकता है. End of the day, what we get is, as the survey suggests, end of the day what we get is this can be approximated as r minus g. So my debt to GDP ratio can be represented as an r minus g, approximated mind you. इसको approximate कर सकता हूँ as r minus g dt minus 1 plus pbt, r minus g dt minus 1 upon GDP in t minus 1 plus pbt. अब ये समझ लो कि मैं इसे approximate कर सकता हूँ in these terms, dt minus 1 upon GDP at t minus 1 and r minus t. आप इसके मैथमेटिक्स में मत जाओ, सर्वे ने अपने बॉक्स में शो किया है, बॉक्स 3 में, but we don't need to do that because it doesn't help us much. Hence we don't need to do that. All right. What we are only interested in knowing is that the real consideration is, if you ask me, that if my rate of interest on debt is less than GDP growth rate, then it opens a space for keeping debt sustainable. It opens a space for keeping debt sustainable in spite of some primary deficit. सोचो, अगर ये वैल्यू कुछ -5% है और तुम्हारा प्राइमरी डेफिसिट 3% है, तो भी तुम 2% कम ही कर रहे हो अपने डेट टू जीडीपी को. इफ योर आर माइनस जी, ऐसा सोच के चलते हैं, चलो, अगर आपके ग्रोथ जीडीपी का ग्रोथ रेट 7% है, आपका रियल इंटरेस्ट रेट, रियल जीडीपी ग्रोथ रेट ऑफ कोर्स, आपका रियल इंटरेस्ट रेट 5% है, तो हर साल आपकी जीडीपी आपके इंटरेस्ट रेट के कंपैरिजन में 2% ज़्यादा बढ़ रही है. If your GDP growth rate is 7% and your real interest rate is 2%, then every year it is rising by 2% more. So if your primary deficit is kept at less than 2% of GDP, it means your borrowing requirements, except for interest payment which you have already covered, are growing at a lesser rate than which you can pay them back. अगर तुम्हारा प्राइमरी डेफिसिट 2% से कम पे बढ़ रहा है, तो फिर इसका मतलब तुम जितने पैसे कमा रहे हो उससे कम तुम्हें देने पड़ने हैं अपने लोन को वापस करने के लिए. तो तुम्हारा लोन धीरे धीरे ओवर द पीरियड कम होता जाएगा. Your loan will become lesser over the period because your growth of GDP is higher than the primary deficit, than the rate of interest that you have to pay on your loan. And the primary deficit window is that difference, R minus G into the ratio of GDP BT minus 1 by GDP T minus 1. वो जो भी रेशियो है वो विंडो ओपन कर रहा है तुम्हारे लिए कि तुम थोड़ा प्राइमरी डेफिसिट रन भी कर लो तो भी तुम्हारे डेट जीडीपी रेशियो सस्टेनेबल होगा. कहने का मतलब क्या है, सुनते रहना ध्यान से अब बात. What this kind of a discussion shows, because the technicality of the discussion is not that important as compared to the whole idea of how that discussion plans out. But just to again tell you that if I take dt upon GDPT, economic survey writes this as dt, small d, is equal to, I'm just using economic survey's language so that you can be in touch with what we are doing, 1 plus RT. So this RT is nothing but rate of interest divided by GDPT. So 1 plus RT upon 1 plus GT, where this GT is the growth rate of GDP that you get, into DT minus 1 minus PBT. वो प्राइमरी सरप्लस ले रहे थे तो माइनस लिख रहे हैं. मैं जब आपको सिखा रहा था इसे प्राइमरी डेफिसिट कह रहा था तो मैंने अपने इक्वेशन में यहाँ प्लस लिख दिया था. ये प्राइमरी डेफिसिट कह रहा था तो मैंने प्लस लिख दिया था. तो चिंता मत करना, इकोनॉमिक सर्वे जो है वो प्राइमरी सरप्लस कह रहा है इसे तो माइनस साइन लगा दिया, बस. और कोई कारण नहीं है. सो डोंट गेट बॉदर्ड दैट ओ सर्वे राइट्स अ माइनस, व्हाई डिड सर राइट अ प्लस. आई रोट अ प्लस बिकॉज आई वाज यूजिंग द टर्म डेफिसिट. तो मैं नेगेटिव टर्म यूज ही कर रहा था तो मैंने प्लस लिख दिया. सर्वे इज यूजिंग अ पॉजिटिव टर्म सरप्लस तो उन्होंने माइनस लिख दिया. दैट्स द ओनली रीजन. What I need you to understand on this is that if interest paid by this is what they show, and then they say that if interest paid by the government is less than growth rate of the government, then this difference R minus G is the window to run a primary deficit and still keep debt sustainable. To run a primary deficit and still keep debt sustainable. कि आप अगर जो मैंने एग्जांपल दिया था कि 7% और 5% है तो तुम 2% तक का डेफिसिट अगर रन कर भी रहे हो तो भी तुम्हारा डेट जीडीपी रेशियो कांस्टेंट ही रहेगा, बढ़ेगा नहीं. तो यू कैन स्टिल रन अ डेफिसिट एंड कीप डेट सस्टेनेबल. सो व्हाट द सर्वे इज नाउ इम्प्लोरिंग, अब सर्वे ये बात कह रहे हैं कि अगर इंडिया में देखा जाए, इफ यू सी इट इन इंडिया, देन आवर ग्रोथ रेट हैज बीन प्रिटी हाई. Our growth rate has been pretty high, and that high growth rate, if we see it in India, then our growth rate has been pretty high in the last 25-30 years, and that high growth rate with an almost constant real interest rate has allowed us to overcome our debt GDP issue. So they say, please understand now, they say that during 96, 97 to 2002-03, the economy was facing a slowdown. Economy faced slowdown. Therefore, government increased fiscal deficit, deficit financing. Government increased fiscal deficit plus introduced structural reforms. Structural reforms like a national highway development program, some examples, National Highway Development Program, Central Electricity Regulation Act, these kind of structural reforms. And that resulted, with all this, that meant that between 2003 to 2009, India had high growth and reduced debt GDP ratio. ये बात सर्वे कहते हैं कि ऐसा इंडिया में देखा गया है, कि ऐसा पास्ट में हुआ कि इंडिया को जब नज़र आया कि हमारा ग्रोथ रेट जो है वो लो हो रहा है, हमारा ग्रोथ रेट जो है वो लो हो रहा है, और साथ में हमारा जो इकोनॉमी है वो रिसेशन में जा सकती है. सो द गवर्नमेंट स्टार्टेड स्पेंडिंग मोर, बट अपार्ट फ्रॉम स्पेंडिंग मोर दे वेंट फॉर स्ट्रक्चरल रिफॉर्म्स, and that resulted in reviving the economy and bringing it back to its high growth position, and then debt GDP ratio also went down. But remember, there is a catch to this. ये बात कहते हुए सर्वे एक बात भूल गए. What the survey misses is that in this time period 2004 to 9, the world economy was also booming. So India was of course helped by the structural reforms done by the government, but also helped by a booming world economy which resulted in increasing growth rate quite high. India was of course helped by the structural reforms, but also helped by a booming world economy, which made growth rate quite high. Then in the survey they say that if we compare not only India, but even other developed economies and emerging markets, if we compare not only India, but even other developed economies and emerging markets, and they give you a lot of tables and a lot of graphs, ignore them. From our exams point of view, not needed. That is just to prove that what is happening. So survey gets two conclusions. One conclusion is among emerging markets like India, China, Malaysia, Vietnam, in all these countries, high growth has been the reason why debt to GDP ratio has continuously fallen. Emerging market economies, India, Vietnam, China, इन सारे countries में high growth की वजह से debt to GDP ratio fall करता रहा और कोई दिक्कत नहीं आई country को fiscal deficit run करने के बाद भी. Even in developed economies, if you take 30 years data, then there is no correlation between debt GDP ratio falling due to high growth or growth rising due to low debt. That is what they are comparing. तो कहते हैं अगर डेवलप्ड इकोनॉमी को कंपेयर करो तो हाई ग्रोथ एंड लो डेट या लो डेट ड्यू टू लो डेट हाई ग्रोथ और ड्यू टू हाई ग्रोथ लेस डेट, इन दोनों में कहीं कोई रिजल्ट नहीं मिलता. देयर इज नो कोरिलेशन बिटवीन हाई ग्रोथ एंड लेस डेट और बिटवीन लेस ग्रोथ between less debt creating high growth. They say if you take the data, it doesn't matter, correlation is zero. They say in case of India, if you take high growth and then compare it to less debt, that is if you take growth in the year T and compare it to debt in year T plus 1, there is a strong correlation that debt falls with high growth. वो कहते हैं अगर आप growth को लेते हो एक पीरियड के और उसके अगले साल के लोन को देखते हो, डेट को लेते हो और फिर 30 साल का डेटा प्लॉट करते हो. If you take a 30 years data, take growth as the explanatory variable and debt as the explained variable, it very well explains it, and there is a strong negative correlation that whenever we have grown well, we have been able to reduce debt. And they say, but on the other hand, if you take debt as the explanatory variable and growth as the explained variable, कि क्या ऐसा हो रहा है कि जिस साल हमने कम लोन लिया उसके अगले साल ज़्यादा ग्रो किए, क्या ऐसा हुआ, तो फिर वहाँ कोई कोरिलेशन नहीं मिलता. The correlation is zero. That if we took less loan and grew more next year, they say then we get no correlation, the correlation is zero. Hence they say that high growth creates less debt, but less debt doesn't necessarily create high growth. What are they challenging? ये कह के क्या challenge कर रहे हैं? Fiscal conservatism को. जो लोग ये कहते हैं कि फिस्कल डेफिसिट को कंट्रोल में रखो, उसी से तुम्हारा इकोनॉमी अच्छा करेगा, तो सर्वे ये कहता है दैट नो, इफ यू टेक द डेटा ऑफ द लास्ट 30 years, you will see that high growth leads to less debt, but in the years of less debt, next year has not been necessarily a high growth year. यहाँ भी एक मिस्टेक है सर्वे की तरफ से. जब आप लोन कम करोगे तो इमीडिएटली ग्रोथ नहीं बढ़ेगा. Reducing your loan means, reducing your debt means, you are doing a structural adjustment. That you are now deciding, I will not be a high debted economy. Then your growth will become more when it will attract investment because of that. And due to that, if your economy absorbs that investment and then grows thereafter, then your growth becomes more. That it attracts investment, that investment is absorbed in your economy, and then growth happens thereafter. So then it attracts investment. But please understand, that will take time. Survey ने क्या किया है? बस एक साल का time lag लिया है. Survey has recorded debt reduction in time period today compared to growth tomorrow, next year. You won't get immediately that much growth. So that is the problem that survey has had. Please be careful on that. कि जब वो कहते हैं कम debt से growth नहीं होता, वो इस बात को ignore कर रहे हैं कि जब आप लोन कम लेते हो तो आपकी fiscal policy better हो जाती है, आप फिस्कल कंसोलिडेशन कर रहे हो, जिसके वजह से आप इन्वेस्टमेंट्स अट्रैक्ट करोगे फ्यूचर में और ग्रोथ हो जाएगा. अब सर्वे इसके लिए दो कारण लाते हैं. यहाँ अब वहाँ से बात फिर इंपॉर्टेंट हो जाती है. सर्वे कहते हैं that there are two reasons why this theory is propagated that government should keep its fiscal deficit in control. Survey says that there are two reasons, that government should keep its fiscal policy in control. द टू रीजंस आर, और क्यों उन्होंने इन दोनों को कंपेयर किया, क्योंकि वो कहते हैं कोरिलेशन -0.7 आ रहा था डेट और ग्रोथ का, डेट रिडक्शन और ग्रोथ का। तो इस कंपैरिजन से सर्वे प्रूव कर रहे हैं दैट ग्रोथ इज रिस्पॉन्सिबल फॉर डेट रिडक्शन, बट डेट रिडक्शन इज नॉट रिस्पॉन्सिबल फॉर ग्रोथ। बट एज आई गिव यू द प्रिकॉशन, कीप द प्रिकॉशन इन माइंड एंड देन एनालाइज दिस पॉइंट। नाउ another thing that they say, which is important, and that's where again you need to take care. Another thing that they say that begins from page number 64 of their discussion. Page number 64 is बीच में एक बॉक्स देते हैं वो आपको पेज 56 पे, मॉडग्लियानी मिलर थ्योरम, बट दैट बॉक्स इज नॉट वेरी इंपॉर्टेंट फ्रॉम आवर एग्जाम्स पॉइंट ऑफ व्यू। उसके आखिरी 5-6 लाइन इंपॉर्टेंट हैं, तो एक वो भी आपको मैं एक्सप्लेन कर ही देता हूँ। जब आप कहते हो मॉडिग्लियानी मिलर थ्योरम, बॉक्स ऑन पेज 56, वो कंपेयर करते हैं दैट इफ अ कॉर्पोरेट टेक्स लोन एंड ग्रोज एंड देयर इज अनदर कॉर्पोरेट that takes lesser loan, and taking loan is what we call leveraged. So if there is one corporate that is heavily leveraged, another which is not, Modigliani-Miller theorem said that an investor will not bother investing in any of the two, because in any case they are taking this loan to create output growth, which will then mean equity shareholders will gain. So as an investor, I will not mind investing in any of them because the economy will keep prevailing. But during the 2007 economic crisis, we realized that corporates which had taken heavy loans collapsed big time, and corporates which had been more disciplined did not collapse. It was implemented on governments also. It was said that if governments don't take loans, then they will be much better off. If governments take loans, they will be worse off. Fiscal conservatism is what we call it. कि fiscally आप रोको ज़्यादा लोन लेने से खुद को. Survey is challenging this. Survey says that if loan is taken, government loan taken for capital creation, that is future investment बढ़ाने के लिए अगर लोन लेते हो, if government loan is taken for capital creation plus government prints money leading to higher future growth, then this is sustainable. If the government takes loans for capital creation, like running a national infrastructure pipeline or creating rural development projects or running infrastructure, education and healthcare projects, and prints money for this purpose, and that your future growth is higher than the rate of money printing. Say you printed money at the rate of 5% extra, but your growth is say 10%, then you will not have inflation and you will not have dilution of your economic activities. But remember again, this is pretty dangerous. In a country like India, where corruption is high and where data is not fully available, it is very difficult to judge if the money printed is actually serving productive purpose and if the government is actually using the money for fiscal consolidation. तो ये assumption लेकर सर्वे ये बात कह रहा है। अगर ये assumptions fail हो गए तो आपकी मैक्रो इकोनॉमी बहुत जोर का झटका खाएगी। So again, when you think about survey, please remember that yes, if these two things are true, that if government is spending more on capex, that is capital expenditure, and if government is spending more with respect to printing money, but using that money for the purpose of development of an economic system, so that in future the growth rate is much higher than the printing of money rate, obviously you will not have inflation. क्यों, क्या कारण है? Money print करने से inflation क्यों होता है? As you print money, you increase demand, but you don't have enough to supply, and that creates inflation. But if you are spending on capital expenditure, investment, creating higher supply possibilities, and you are a developing economy like India with very much underutilized resources, then it's possible कि आप सरकार जो है वो खर्च करे और production capacity बढ़ाए, and as the government increases production capacity, it results in increasing supply. So even when you print more money and increase demand, your inflation may not pick up as much. This is the logic. ठीक है, इस लॉजिक में कोई गलत नहीं है। मैं फिर रिपीट करूंगा, द ओनली प्रॉब्लम इज इफ यू आर नॉट वेरी केयरफुल अबाउट योर एक्सपेंडिचर एंड if your money supply is increasing, meeting those frivolous expenditures of the government, पॉपुलिस्टिक एक्सपेंडिचर, सब्सिडी दे दिया फ्री का, लोगों को खुश करने के लिए, थोड़ा कहीं इलेक्शन है तो वहाँ पे प्रोजेक्ट्स अनाउंस कर दिए, इफ दिस इज हैपनिंग देन यू मे नॉट गेट द रिवॉर्ड्स वेल एंड दैट विल रिजल्ट इन hurting the economy. Also, you need to make sure that your structural reforms continue. If you plan to sell your public sector, bring farming laws, better farming laws, change your dimensions in banking sector, but if people don't allow you to do all that, and in turn you have spent a lot of money and printed a lot of money, then you have not done your structural reforms and you have increased your fiscal expenditure and monetary policies printing, and that will create more inflation and less growth, giving huge shock to the economy. तो structural reforms के साथ ही ये cyclical expansion होना चाहिए। जब देख लिया कि structural reforms भी successful हो रहे हैं तो cyclical expansion करो, work करेगा, मुझे कोई आपत्ति नहीं है। You know, that you do your cyclical expansion with structural reforms happening, it will work. But if you only do cyclical expansion, fiscal and monetary policy, and your structural reform don't happen, and if you don't spend much on your investment programs, then you will have trouble in the overall system of things. You know, this is what I was trying to push through. So please be careful on that part of the survey. Now, survey again discusses, from page 64, they have a good discussion. They say that 2 reasons for suggesting that expansionary fiscal policy is not effective. So they say 1, Ricardian equivalence, you know, REP as they call it. According to this, if government reduces tax by ₹1 today, then it increases borrowings by ₹1, and in future they can be paid 1 plus R, the interest rate you have to pay on borrowing, to the rate T. If you pay T plus 1 time period in future, they can be paid this amount only by taxing more. Only by taxing more. This was Ricardian equivalence program as it was suggested, that if government reduces tax by ₹1 today and increases borrowings by ₹1, then in future they will have incurred this much borrowing returns और tax करना पड़ेगा ज़्यादा. So a rational individual, as soon as they will see government reducing the tax, will start saving that money, and public savings will rise, so that whenever the government increases the tax rate, they can pay it back. Now this theory means that consumption will decrease with increase in government expenditure or reduction in tax, because people will expect that in future this money will be taken from them. But this theory has a lot of restrictive assumption that everybody pays tax, government imposes only a lump sum tax, that is one-time tax, everybody has complete information, government administration is fully in place. ये सारे assumptions इंडिया में नहीं वर्क करते. रियल वर्ल्ड में ये देखा गया है that Ricardian equivalence proposition has not worked. Rather, whenever government has gone for an expansionary fiscal policy, it has resulted in, and when I will teach you macro, I will teach you Ricardian equivalence in more detail. But whenever government has gone for an expansionary fiscal policy, it has resulted in pushing out public consumption and people's consumption and reducing their savings. ऐसा बहुत often देखा गया है. तो इसका मतलब एग्रीगेट एक्सपेंडिचर बढ़ता है गवर्नमेंट के एक्सपेंशन करने से. तो ये सर्वे कहते हैं दैट जब ये टेस्ट किया उन्होंने 1950 to 86 का डेटा लेकर इंडिया में और 1990 to 2018 का डेटा लेकर, दोनों ही केस में ये देखा गया कि रिकार्डियन इक्विवेलेंस वर्क नहीं करता. In both cases, it was seen that Ricardian equivalence doesn't work in India. In India, rather, as government spends more, people are found to be spending more. And I'll tell you a reason. When government spends more and say creates an electricity generation unit, road, and so on, it encourages private sector to come and invest and people to consume more. Because people get employment, people get business opportunities, and that pushes consumption up in India. So that is why rather than reducing consumption, government expenditures have shown sometimes increasing consumption, sometimes not increasing consumption. So there is no correlation between the two. So Ricardian equivalence doesn't work in Indian context because the assumptions of Ricardian equivalence do not work in Indian context. Please understand the point here. That is why in the Modigliani-Miller theorem, when they said that if you print extra money, that 1 rupee output is a claim that people have on output in your economy. So if your output also increases, then more money printing will not have a problem. अगर सेम आउटपुट रह गया जैसे डेवलप्ड इकोनॉमी में होता है तो अब ज़्यादा पैसे और आउटपुट कम तो इन्फ्लेशनरी तो वो जो लोग पैसे होल्ड कर रहे हैं सबको वैल्यू डाइल्यूट करता है लेकिन अगर आउटपुट भी बढ़ा तो उस केस में जो कंजम्पशन वगैरह बढ़ने के साथ तो उस केस में मनी प्रिंटिंग कैन बी ओके बट इंपॉर्टेंट इज दैट आउटपुट शुड राइज एट अ फास्टर रेट देन द रेट ऑफ प्रिंटिंग मनी. Another thing they bring in, apart from Ricardian equivalence, is the method of crowding out. Well, the theory is this. If government expenditure increases, then government borrowings increase. So liquidity in the economy decreases. Liquidity का मतलब money available for usage. मनी जो यूसेज के लिए अवेलेबल है उसे हम कहते हैं लिक्विडिटी. तो गवर्नमेंट एक्सपेंडिचर बढ़ा तो उसके वजह से बोरोइंग्स सरकार के बढ़े, बॉन्ड सप्लाई बढ़ाएंगे वो. एज दे इंक्रीज बॉन्ड सप्लाई, बॉन्ड प्राइसेस विल फॉल, इंटरेस्ट रेट विल राइज बिकॉज लिक्विडिटी इज नाउ लेस. सरकार वो लिक्विडिटी मॉप अप कर रही है. सो विद दिस लिक्विडिटी डिक्रीज, इंटरेस्ट रेट इंक्रीजेस एंड प्राइवेट इन्वेस्टमेंट्स फॉल. प्राइवेट इन्वेस्टमेंट फॉल्स. इसे कहते हैं crowding out. Government expenditure increases, government borrowings increase, liquidity decreases, interest rate increases, private investment decrease. This is what is called crowding out. Again, survey says that finding evidence in India, it is seen that if government expenditure is rising, interest rate has not shown that rising trend. Survey says, looking at the trend in the last 30 years, increase in fiscal expansion, interest rates have maintained quite a constant trend. So interest rate has not shown very high correlation negative with increase in government expenditure, positive with increase in government expenditure. If at all, it has been observed in years like 2003 to 2008. अगर कुछ देखा भी गया है तो ये देखा गया है in the years 2003 to 8 या 2012-14 that with increased government expenditure, interest rate has rather gone down. With increased government expenditure, interest rate has rather gone down with maybe excess liquidity being made available, from the banking system. That with excess liquidity, central bank ने ज़्यादा money print कर दिया, and with excess liquidity being made available from banking system, interest rate has shown a downward trend with increased government expenditure. इसका मतलब क्या हुआ? Crowding out की जगह इंडिया में crowding in होता है. When government spends money, A, it puts money into the hands of the people. B, corporates get supported with better infrastructure, better logistical improvement, and they get encouraged to spend more. They get more orders for themselves. And it also attracts more investments into the country, which results in crowding in of the investment rather than crowding out. The survey also says that it has been observed per se that India, the theory of crowding out assumes that saving will remain constant. तभी तो सरकार ने लिक्विडिटी ले ली तो प्राइवेट सेक्टर को नहीं मिला. लेकिन इंडिया जैसी कंट्री में वेयर यू हैव यंगर पॉपुलेशन एंड पीपल एंटरिंग मोर इनटू फॉर्मल वर्कफोर्स विद गवर्नमेंट गिविंग मोर अपॉर्चुनिटीज एंड प्राइवेट सेक्टर इंक्रीजिंग इट्स डिमांड फॉर इन्वेस्टमेंट, इट विल मीन मोर इनकम क्रिएशन एंड मोर इनकम क्रिएशन कैन ऑल्सो एड टू मोर सेविंग्स. तो सेविंग्स बढ़ गई तो लिक्विडिटी बढ़ जाएगी, बैंक्स के पास ज़्यादा डिपॉजिट्स आने लगेंगे, वो और लेंड करने को तैयार हो जाएंगे. सो 2 reasons they give for restricted crowding out in India. One, they say that with increase in government spending and creating capital expenditure, it results in with increase in government spending and creating capital expenditure, it results in more amount of orders for private sector, convenience to produce for private sector. So rather than crowding out, they crowd in. Second, India has a young population. Demographic dividend is in India's favor. As more people will get employed, it will result in more and more income generation, and that will again reduce savings. तो ये दो कारण दिए उन्होंने कि क्राउडिंग आउट नहीं होगा इंडिया में या नहीं होता. एक और कारण देते हैं वो. They give one more reason. They say monetary policy is endogenous. They give one more reason. They say monetary policy is endogenous. Endogenous monetary policy means that as government starts spending more and realizes that growth is going down in a counter-cyclical policy. तो जब सरकार देखती है कि ग्रोथ में कमी आ रही है, तो सरकार मनी प्रिंट करती है ज़्यादा ताकि लिक्विडिटी प्रिवेल करा सके. So when government sees that growth is being reduced, they start printing more money to create liquidity, which reduces interest rate also. So in that R minus G situation, think there are 2-3 things which are happening. Plus or say minus P, B, T. There are 2-3 things which are happening. R will go down as interest rate even if G has gone up. R will go down, तो R minus G जरूरी नहीं बढ़े. G बढ़ रहा है, but R can go down. Why will this R go down? Why will this R go down? Because government is now allowing central bank to print more money to support growth. And this primary deficit will come down because with high growth, tax collection will be high. So with high tax revenue generation, with high growth, and compared along with that, interest rate falling, overall we can sustain the debt even if government is taking more debt. जैसे सरकार ने फिस्कल डेफिसिट बढ़ाया, क्राउडिंग आउट कम होगा दो कारणों से. पहला कारण एक है कि आपके प्राइवेट सेक्टर के लिए प्रोड्यूस करना ज़्यादा कन्वीनियंट हो गया. अच्छी सड़कें मिल गई, इलेक्ट्रिसिटी की व्यवस्था हो गई, लॉजिस्टिकल कॉस्ट्स कम हो गए, तो इनकरेज किया प्राइवेट एंटरप्रेन्योरशिप को. So private entrepreneurship gets encouraged with better electrification, better roads, and so on. And it encourages people or system to consume more and save more because income levels are going up. So with demographic dividend and an underutilized resource, again India will have higher income and that will lead to higher savings. Also, as more growth happens, your G goes up, growth goes up, and your tax revenue generation will rise, so your primary deficit will be controlled, and overall your debt will look sustainable. So the survey is imploring that the policy then followed should be counter-cyclical, and India should not become fiscally conservative. Then the final point they put for us, and that point they start bringing in from page number 69 onwards with structure of India's debt. The structure of India's debt. They say that the structure of India's debt is very sustainable. India's debt to GDP ratio is around 72%. It was 83% in 2003. So when you look at structure of India's debt, let's see, is India's debt sustainable? 1, lower debt to GDP ratio compared to OECD and other emerging market economies. They take a table and they show that among the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development countries and among emerging market economies, India's debt to GDP ratio is quite contained. काफ़ी कम है हमारा, तो एक ये फ़ायदा है, इसका मतलब बहुत ज़्यादा लोन्ड अप नहीं है. सेकेंड, फॉरेन लोन ऑफ सोवरेन, सोवरेन मतलब गवर्नमेंट, सोवरेन का मतलब गवर्नमेंट. So foreign loan of sovereign is very less. Among total loans of government, not even 5%. सरकार के टोटल लोन में 5% भी फॉरेन लोन्स नहीं है. External debt is only 5.9% of central government debt. I'm sorry for that, just missed on it. I had 4.9% in my mind. 5.9% is of total government, central government debt is foreign loans. तो वहां वल्नरेबिलिटी कम है कि टोटल गवर्नमेंट डेट के फॉरेन लोन सिर्फ 5.9% हैं. डोमेस्टिक लोन्स में क्या बेनिफिट है? यू कैन प्रिंट मनी एंड पे देम बैक. तो डिफॉल्ट का खतरा नहीं है. यू नो, वी डोंट हैव द थ्रेट ऑफ डिफॉल्टिंग. ऑल्सो in the total public debt, 70% is held by the central government, 30% by the state government. So that means still central government doesn't hold debt more than 100% of GDP. And even in the debt held, total debt of central government is only less than 50%. सेंट्रल सर गवर्नमेंट की जो लोन है वो जीडीपी के 50% से भी कम है. तो इसका मतलब सेंट्रल गवर्नमेंट्स कैपेबिलिटी टू पे बैक विल बी इवन हायर. फिर तीसरी अच्छी बात क्या है? फ्लोटिंग रेट्स के लोन बहुत कम है. Less than 6% loans on floating rate. तो अगर इंटरेस्ट रेट बहुत ज्यादा फ्लक्चुएट भी करता है तो भी इंडिया विल बी एबल टू पे बैक इट्स लोन. और एक चौथी बात क्या है? लॉन्ग टर्म लोन्स डोमिनेट. जो इंडियन सरकार के लोन्स हैं, यू नो, more than 90% of loans of government of India are long term in nature. You know, the bonds are issued for 8 years, 10 years. So they are not coming for immediate refund, which means we have time to settle down on this. So in that case, it means that interest rate volatility will not be there. The risk of rollover का मतलब होता है आज लोन आ गया, अब किसी दूसरे से पैसा मांग के उस लोन को चुकाओ. ठीक है, वहां पर आप टर्म यूज करते हो रोल ओवर ऑफ डेट. रोल ओवर, अब ये खतरनाक हालत होती है. अगर अगले ने लोन नहीं दिया तो आज के लोन कैसे चुकाऊंगा? This rollover threat is low in India. You don't have to take loans today to pay back loans of yesterday. Loans are far in future. So you can very well grow for some more years and then accumulate reserves and pay them back. Also remember, our total foreign exchange loans are $556 billion. Total, private, government, सब मिलाकर, long term, short term, सब मिलाकर. And our foreign exchange reserves are touching $590 billion. That's huge, you know, that if you look at it. Government loans are not even $100 billion. You know, total government foreign exchange loans are not even $100 billion. So good enough to satisfy the requirement. And short-term loans are only $88 billion. समझाना ये चाह रहा हूँ that overall economic survey is right in saying that our debt situation is quite okay right now. You know, so we can afford taking some extra debt given that we are in a COVID situation. We can afford taking some extra debt given that we are in COVID situation. Then they say that the interest rate in India, you know, that's another thing. Interest rate in India is approximately 7.5% even for long term. Now, assuming inflation, this is nominal interest rate, money terms mein. Assuming inflation at approximately 4%, the real interest cost that India has for even next 10 years will be 3.5%. In दोनों का difference. The nominal interest rate is 7.5%. Inflation rate is 4%. तो subtract कर दें, तो real interest cost ये लगना है इंडिया को. That means even if India's real GDP growth is slightly above 3.5%, we can see sustainability because G will be greater than R. You know, if the real GDP growth is even slightly above 3.5%, we see sustainability. So in a bad scenario also, India can believe that with growth, sustainability can happen. Because interest rate has remained more or less stable in India. Growth has been the prime factor, and all across the world. Growth has been the prime factor. So if growth happens, debt can be paid back. But again, I come back to the most important point, and now you should read the last page of chapter 1 when they talk about structural reforms in mining sector, in public sector, in agriculture. You know, these reforms are important. If we don't do structural reforms, then growth will not happen with a lot of security. And if growth doesn't happen, then that will mean that my R minus G will turn positive because rate of interest is 7.58%. So if your nominal GDP, real GDP growth comes to something like 2% and your inflation is 4, you're still growing lesser than the interest payment cost. So today Indian debt looks sustainable, survey is correct on that, and they suggest the policy that therefore India should shed policy conservatism. and go ahead and spend more. But again, I repeat, there should be 3-4 care we should take. One, we should spend more on capital expenditure. This year's budget has shown that 34% increase in the capital expenditure in budget, taking it above 5 lakh crore. That's a welcome move. That is what should be done. Even if we are running a high fiscal deficit, अगर हम हाई फिस्कल डेफिसिट रन भी करें तो ये करना चाहिए जो इस साल बजट में थोड़ी बहुत बातें की हमने. तो पहला, कैपिटल एक्सपेंडिचर शुड बी हाई. क्यों? हाई कैपिटल एक्सपेंडिचर विल मीन कैपेसिटी क्रिएशन. मोर कैपेसिटी क्रिएशन विल देन मीन फ्यूचर आउटपुट प्रोड्यूस्ड. तो अगर आज तुम खर्चे ज्यादा कर भी रहे हो, लोन ले भी रहे हो, कल को पे बैक कर दोगे क्योंकि ग्रोथ ज्यादा होगा. If you are taking more loan today, you will be able to pay back tomorrow because growth will be higher. So that is okay. Second, if you are running a high fiscal deficit today, make sure you keep doing your structural reforms and make your economy more and more efficient. And structural reforms imply the points I told you: improving input markets, training of workforce should be better, availability of land should be better, improving ease of doing business, ease of entering into India, not for foreigners only, even Indian investors. So reducing the restrictions on entry. Contract enforcement should be better. We should have better rules on intellectual property rights, environmental protection laws. We should reduce logistical costs of the firm by giving them better storage facilities, better connectivity, and so on. These are structural reforms needed. Farming should be made more productive per se. These are structural reforms needed. So once you do these structural reforms, then your growth rate can be high, and government investment should be in areas which are high growth areas like infrastructure, like labor-intensive, lower-end industries like textile, leather goods, footwear that is, producing commodities with respect to small electronic appliances, production-linked incentives given to those firms. This can do good for us. And third, making sure that expenditure of the government doesn't rise due to wasteful policies which cannot be audited. जो खर्च किया उसकी एक एक पैसे का हिसाब जरूर होना चाहिए ऑडिटिंग करके कि कहाँ खर्च हुआ और क्या ग्रोथ दिया, और अगर एक साल में वो ग्रोथ नहीं दिया तो कम करो उस ग्रोथ को, फिर कम करो उस एक्सपेंडिचर को. So this is how, if we go, then debt is sustainable and this theory works well. If we don't, then the theory doesn't work well. I hope you were helped by this discussion. For any further queries, you can always ask me. You can send me a message, you can send me a mail. I deliberately don't take questions while discussing with you because I think that when a wholesome discussion is happening, let's do it wholesome and then go back. So for structural reforms part that need to be done, go back now to Economic Survey Chapter 1. See the last page where they mention about mining and the benefits. They mention about manufacturing reforms benefit, corporate sector reforms and benefit. That इस तरह से अगर रिफॉर्म्स हो तो हम ग्रो कर सकते हैं और डेट की कोई चिंता नहीं कर सकते. लेकिन नहीं होंगे तो डेट आगे चल के दिक्कत करेगा, एंड द प्रॉब्लम दैट डेट विल क्रिएट विल बी एन इकोनॉमिक क्राइसिस बिकॉज देन वी विल बिकम ओवर लेवरेज्ड. ऑलराइट,